Hi, it's Dennis Daly. During my visit to London, I did a lot of walking around, and one day I walked into a surprise. It's a place called the British Garden Museum, and the woman who was running it at the time was ROSEMARY NICHOLSON. She says the whole area used to be a church under the control of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
It was deconsecrated in 1972, and the reason for that, the original reason was the fact that until the war, there was a clustering population, of hundreds of years' duration, almost up to the railings of the churchyard. With the war came extensive bombing. It was absolutely flattened all round about here. The fabric of this building didn't suffer at all, but all the windows were blown in. But of course it meant that the population was dispersed, and this meant a diminution in the congregation. And it struggled on, and in 1972 it was closed. And the church commissioners who owned it left it, hoping to get an alternative use for something, a library or something like that. All the suggestions that were put forward fell through, and there was a demolition order on it for the end of November 1976. And by that time, the roof had fallen in, the floor had fallen in. The whole place was about 4 inches thick under centuries of black soot and pollution. There was a hunting park which is now Kennington Park, which is just at the end of this road, at the end of Lambeth Road. And that was where the king hunted deer and so on. There was also a great deal of industry along the river in boat building. But of course then it was little more than a village, and the only great house was Lambeth Palace. And that is just over the wall from where we're standing now. And that's the London home of the Archbishop of Canterbury. But this church, which is now a museum, is much older than the palace. The original church was built in 1062 by the Countess Goda, who was a sister of Edward the Confessor, when he was building Westminster Abbey. And there have been about 3 churches on the site since, but never actually pulling the churches down and starting again. They've been added to over the centuries. And from medieval times, a lot of it has been left. The pillars in the building itself go down into the bases of the medieval pillars. So we know exactly the size, the dimensions of that medieval church.
This may sound rather naive to say this, but I think one of the things growing up in the States that it is easy to forget is that how new the American culture is in many ways compared to many cities here in Europe. That many of the things we would consider to be nearly ancient in the United States are nothing compared to what you'll find here in the UK and on the continent.
That's absolutely true. When my husband and I went over for our first visit to America in 1983 to Virginia, this was a thing that struck us when we were taken round, particularly Williamsburg, and shown, this dates back to 16-something, and this is so ancient. And one thought, well, my goodness, of course it is ancient to you, naturally. But there's such a wonderful link here, just where we're standing, because that tomb over there is the tomb where the whole family of Tredescant is buried. And the younger John Tredescant, because there were 2, father and son, and the younger John Tredescant went 3 times to America, plant hunting. The first time he went was 1622, and then 1634, and then he went a 3rd time. And brought back so many of the things that you actually see in this garden today from your country.
Rosemary, let's get to the very heart of the matter, and this is where I feel bad sometimes that it's radio and not television. What is the fascination with the country garden, whether it be photos of Versailles or some of the palaces or Callaway Gardens in the States? There is such a wonderful organized gentility about it. How far back does the tradition go, and what kind of comments do you get from people?
That's 1,000 questions there, yeah. All rolled into one. Well, I think the thing is the question of the importance of gardens, I mean, it goes right back to the earliest. As far as the monarchy goes back, they were always, as they were known, they're not so much as gardens, but as pleasances, where they, walked and they picked their flowers and so on. And, of course, the great thing was plants and herbs grown for medicinal use, or for, my goodness, when you think of sort of medieval halls, where there were just arrow slits for windows, and they strewed the fresh herbs on the floor among rushes to keep it fresh, and also for the fragrance. But the importance of gardens, yes, goes back very, very far. But there is an enormous resurgence now in this country and in your country for the old historic flowers. I think people are beginning, or have begun over the last years, to be terribly interested in the origins of the plants, how they came in. How they came into this country, or how they came into your country. When my husband and I were over there in '83, we went over to take part in a symposium in the Valentine Museum in Richmond on that very subject, the exchange of plants across the sea, from you to us and from us to you. And it was absolutely riveting.
I never thought about plants coming this direction. I can see very much that settlers who came from the British Isles, who came from Europe to settle in America,
yes,
would have brought part of their culture with them, and that certainly would have been some plants and flowers. But I never stopped to think that there would be an attraction to bring them back this way, the ones that, of course, were not native here.
Absolutely. A tremendous importance. I mean, that younger, both the Tedescans, but the younger one, who was the one who travelled furthest, going to America, he was absolutely fascinated in anything that was new growing there. When we were staying in Williamsburg, we were taken out to Jamestown to see the very place where the early settlers landed at Jamestown. And we were taken through woods, and there were growing sumac trees, yucca, all absolutely new to us. And over there is a yucca. And we've got there are two yuccas. There's a sumac tree over there. But you see, with us, it's just a shrub, that one over there, where the gentleman in the green jacket is. And, of course, in your country, they're trees. The windows had all been vandalised and were boarded up. And the whole of this area was just the local rubbish tip. There was knee-high grass, no paths, of course. And you couldn't see the recumbent tombstones, and those two, that's the Tedescans over there, and this one's Bligh of the Bounty and his wife, Admiral Bligh of the Bounty.
Captain Admiral now.
Yes, well, he was.
I'm used to calling him Captain, yes.
But he was Captain, yes.
Isn't it funny how the culture is? I picture Charles Lawton when you say that for some reason.
Yes,
from the movie. No, I should not at all.
Because Charles Lawton depicted him as such a tyrant, and he wasn't like that at all. I mean, good naval discipline, but not a real tyrant. But those tombs, which, as you see, are quite substantial, you couldn't see them for nettles and brambles and ivy climbing all over them. And what happened was that my husband and I, when we lived in the country, we had a lovely garden, and but just as amateur gardeners, but we'd always been terribly interested and fascinated by plant hunters and what motivated them to go so far afield and bring back such treasure for our gardens. And of all the plant hunters, the Tedescans were the ones that interested us most. And it was just to see the tomb that we came down here one Saturday afternoon from Chelsea, where we live over the river, and were ill-prepared for what met our sight, because here was this ruin. And, I mean, not only every sort of filth and rubbish and old bits of bicycle and car body and so on lying about.
It must have just been a gut-wrenching experience for you when you finally got here.
It was. Well, actually, I said to my husband, because there were also homeless tramps and alcoholics lying about under bits of cardboard and carpet. And I said to my husband, I don't want to go any further. I don't want to see the Tedescans too. Let's get away as quickly as possible. And then you mentioned to me earlier about having seen the walkway, 1977.
I should point out this is a walkway, and it goes across the Thames to the area where Parliament is. And I just happened to notice that restoration dates from 77.
That's right. And we noticed that, we read that this was going to come about. to recognise the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, and it was especially to bring the hundreds of visitors due in London for that Silver Jubilee to this part of London, to bring them over London and Lambeth Bridge so that they, could see a different part of London.
But what you're saying is that what they would have seen would have certainly not been to anyone's benefit.
This is
would have misrepresented the city and been very depressing.
And we just thought, how could the powers that be think of spending quite a considerable amount of money on this walkway when the first thing they see when they cross Lambeth Bridge is that appalling sight of this place. Anyway, we went on at each other, what a disgrace, how dreadful. And then we thought, well, what could we really do about it? And the only thing that presented itself to us was that we should write to the Times. Everyone writes the Times whenever they've got anything that they want to get off their chest. And we wrote and suggested that as a Jubilee project, this place should be brought back into some use. And we thought, this is wonderful. That letter would be printed. We'll have huge support coming in. But the letter wasn't printed. And we thought, well, that we tried at least. And then to our amazement, we had a letter from William Rees-Mogg, who's now Lord Rees-Mogg, who was then the editor of the Times. And he explained why he hadn't printed the letter. But he said, I'm very interested. And if you ever get anything off the ground regarding that place, I'll give it what help I can. So here we were, with a sort of might of the Times behind us. So we took a Xerox copy of the letter and sent it next door to the Archbishop, because we couldn't think of anyone else to approach.
It is his backyard.
That's absolutely right. And he asked whether two people could try and set about trying to save the place. And we had a kind, if rather gloomy, letter back from him saying that he thought it really had gone too far, that it was in, too bad a state. But it wasn't he we must approach, but the relevant committee of the church commissioners. And that was how it began. We went to see them, and we had an almighty fight, because, of course, they thought it had gone too far, too. And they also thought that two perfectly ordinary people, it wasn't as though we were a firm of architects or anything like that. And they swore we'd never be able to do it. But we've managed it so far.
I mentioned hedges. I don't know what the exact pattern is. It's something that you might see repeated on a quilt, but it's fine lines of hedges.
A knot garden.
This is a knot
garden. A knot garden.
A knot.
Very old. They date back to the Elizabethan times, that 16th century. And it really was this intricate design of, as you would see on old book bindings and that sort of thing, do you know? Or, you mention a quilt.
But more intricate, really, than that. A book binding sets it in proper perspective, I think.
Yes, that's right.
What is the reaction you get from visitors, particularly young children, students who may come here? What kind of feedback do you get?
Absolutely fascinated. They're absolutely fascinated. And we're inundated with requests from school teachers saying, can they bring their classes of children? And the great difficulty is, it's all right as long as they bring them, and they bring staff to keep them under control. But you've seen the museum. Yes. There could be a lot of damage done, children rushing along with lawnmowers and things like that.
Especially if they all just pick one flower.
That's absolutely true. About 4 years ago, there was a youngish man walking around the museum, and he was there for ages. And mostly, people come there, perhaps spend an hour, but this chap was there all day. And in the end, in the afternoon, I said to him, I'm so interested, are you a botanist? What is your special interest? And he said, I'm the director of Agecroft Hall in Richmond, in Virginia. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
And I had never heard of it. And he said this was a house that was built in the 16th century, i.e. 15-something, up in Lancashire. And in time, mining went on underneath it. So there was subsidence. And, a very, very wealthy American took it over bodily, brick by brick, to this marvellous site just outside Richmond, re-erected it. And then they've made it into a museum of that period, bringing in from all over the world, Elizabethan cradles and all these sort of things. And it's quite beautiful. Not that I'd seen it then, but it was very interesting. And he said to me, what we are wanting to do is now to make a period garden of exactly that period. I'm so interested in everything being done here. Would you help us? And I said, yes, of course we would. We can't give you plants because of your restrictions. But I said, you know, anything you want to know, and seeds and so on. So this went on for about 4 years, and the October before last, he wrote to me and he said, the garden, you know, it's looking wonderful. Will you come over and open it in May? And I thought, well, you know, people say those things, but it doesn't happen. But they did. They asked me over. And here's this gorgeous, beautiful house, and the garden is exquisite. And there's a big plaque up on the wall, and it says, this garden, made to commemorate John Tredescant, who plant hunted here in the 17th century, was made with the help of the Museum of Garden History in London.
A person listening to this, obviously this program is only heard in the U.S. Give us an address a person could write to if they think they're heading this direction or just want some information.
All right, Dennis, if they write to the Museum of Garden History, Lambeth Palace Road, London, SE1 7LB, and that's the address.
Rosemary, thank you.
Rosemary Nicholson, living proof of the fact that there are nice people around if you just walk in the right gate. I'm Dennis Day.